David Okafor was 42 years old, and for 11 years he believed his marriage was real. He was an estate attorney, quiet, disciplined, the kind of man who built other people's legacies while asking nothing for himself. His wife, Selena, was the only daughter of a self-made billionaire. And when her father Philip died on a Tuesday night, David was the one holding the old man's hand. Selena was in the hallway, on her phone. By Thursday morning, she had served him with divorce papers, already armed with Atlanta's most feared high-asset attorney, a woman who doesn't get retained overnight. Selena believed she was walking away from a modest marriage and into $500 million, free and clear. What she didn't know was that David had drafted every word of her father's will himself, and the man she just discarded had been quietly waiting for exactly this moment. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The monitor beside Philip Hargrove's bed beeped soft and slow, like a clock that had almost run out of time. David Okafor sat in the chair closest to the bed, his large hand wrapped around the old man's thin one. Philip's fingers were cool. His breathing came in long, shallow pulls, the kind that had a sound to it now, a faint rattle deep in the chest that the nurses had stopped trying to explain away. The room smelled like antiseptic and something floral from a candle Patricia had brought 3 days ago. The blinds were half open. Atlanta's city lights pressed soft and orange against the night sky outside. David had been here since 6 o'clock. It was almost midnight. He looked at the door. Through the narrow window in it, he could see the hallway, bright fluorescent white, and Selena standing near the nurse's station with her phone pressed to her ear. She had her back turned. Her posture was relaxed. She laughed once, quietly, covering her mouth with 2 fingers the way she did when she didn't want to seem like she was laughing. David watched her for a moment. Then he looked back at Philip. He had known this man for 11 years, had come into his life as a son-in-law and somehow become something closer. A confidant, a trusted professional, the person Philip called when he needed someone who would tell him the truth without softening it first. Every major decision in the Hargrove estate had passed through David's hands. Every trust document, every amendment, every codicil. $500 million, carefully arranged, and David had touched every piece of it with the same clean hands he'd always had. He thought about the first year of marriage to Selena. How bright everything had felt. She was magnetic and sharp, and she had looked at him like he was someone worth looking at. He had believed that. He had built a whole life around believing it. 11 years. Philip's hand moved slightly, just a small curl of the fingers, the way a sleeping person reaches for something they can't name. David tightened his grip. "I've got you," he said quietly. Just that. Philip Hargrove died at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. His breathing simply stopped. No drama. No final words. Just a long exhale, and then a stillness that filled the room like something solid. David sat with him for a moment. He pressed the call button for the nurse. He bowed his head. When Selena came back into the room 4 minutes later, her phone was finally in her purse. She looked at her father in the bed, and her face arranged itself into something appropriate. A tightening around the eyes, a pressed-together mouth. She put a hand on the blanket near his feet, but did not touch him. She did not cry. David noticed. He filed it away. He said nothing. The next 48 hours belonged entirely to him. He called the funeral home. He called Philip's attorney. He called Patricia, who cried on the phone for a long time, and he stayed on the line with her until she was steady. He drafted the family announcement. He confirmed the arrangements for the obituary with the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. He answered emails from Philip's business associates, each one measured and personal and written at 1 in the morning from the kitchen table while Selena slept. She appeared for the public moments. The funeral home consultation. She wore black, She was gracious. She accepted condolences with a practiced tilt of her head and a soft voice that made people squeeze her hands and tell her how strong she was. She was very good at this. She had always been very good at this, but at home, she was somewhere else entirely, eating in front of her laptop, taking phone calls in the bedroom with the door closed, moving through the house like David was furniture, present, familiar, requiring nothing. He did not push. He told himself grief came in different shapes. He believed it, almost. 2 mornings after Philip died, David was at his desk by 7:30. The office was quiet. His assistant didn't come in until 9, and he liked the early hours, the stillness, the feeling of a day not yet interrupted. He had a mug of coffee going cold at his elbow, and a stack of probate filings open in front of him. The process server arrived at 8:14 a.m. Young guy, nervous eyes. He confirmed David's name twice before he held out the envelope. David took it, opened it at his desk. He read the first page, then the second. Then he went back to the first and read it again. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Filed by Selena Hargrove Okafor. The date on the filing was yesterday, 1 day after Philip's burial. David set the papers down on his desk. He did not reach for his phone. He did not stand up. He sat very still in his chair, the morning light coming in flat and gray through the office window, and he stared at the papers for a long time. He picked up his pen. He pulled a legal pad from the drawer. He began to write. The petition was 11 pages long. David read it once, slow and straight through. Then he set it down, picked up his coffee, found it cold, and set that down too. Then he read the petition again. Adrienne Voss. Her name was printed on the second page, under counsel for petitioner, in clean block letters that somehow still managed to feel like a threat. Adrienne Voss was not a divorce attorney you called the week your father died. She was not someone you found in a moment of grief-soaked impulse. Her firm had a 6-week intake process. She required full financial disclosure before she agreed to take a case. She charged a $50,000 retainer, and she earned it. She had dismantled 17 high-asset marriages in the last 4 years, and walked away from every one of them without a loss. You did not retain Adrienne Voss in a day. You did not retain Adrienne Voss in a week. David looked at the filing date again. Then he looked at the date Philip had been buried. 1 day. He placed the petition flat on his desk, squared the edges carefully against the corner of his keyboard. His face was still. His hands were still. The only thing moving in the office was the second hand on the wall clock behind him, and the thin line of steam still rising from a mug that had gone completely cold. The filing requested equitable distribution of all marital assets. It included an emergency motion to freeze 3 joint accounts pending valuation. It cited irreconcilable differences. It listed the date of separation as, and David paused here, reading it a third time, 11 days ago, 4 days before Philip died. He sat with that number. 11 days ago, Selena had been sitting across from him at the kitchen table, telling him she was worried about her father's comfort levels, asking David if he thought the hospice nurses were attentive enough. She had touched his hand when she said it. 11 days ago. He did not pick up the phone to call her. There was nothing to say to her that would matter. Whatever she had been when she touched his hand at that kitchen table, she was not confused, and she was not impulsive, and she was not someone who needed him to explain what he was holding in his hands. She knew exactly what she had filed and exactly when she had filed it. David pulled open his desk drawer. He took out a fresh legal pad, yellow, wide-ruled, the same brand he had used since law school, and he uncapped a pen. He wrote one name in the center of the first page, Jerome Okafor. He picked up his phone and called his brother. Jerome answered on the second ring. "Hey!" His voice was easy, slightly distracted, the sound of a man mid-spreadsheet. "I need you," David said. "Not later." Now! A pause. Jerome knew his brother well enough to hear what was underneath those 3 words. What happened? Selena filed this morning. Adrienne Voss is her attorney. Another pause. Longer. Voss? Yes. That's not a grief decision. No, David said. It is not. I need you to pull every financial thread connected to Selena. Quietly. Her personal accounts. Any LLCs tied to her name. Wire transfers. Anything moving in or out over the last 2 years. Can you do that today? I can start today. Jerome's voice had shifted. The distracted quality was gone entirely. I'll call you tonight. Thank you. David hung up. He looked at the petition one more time, then turned it face down on his desk. He opened his laptop and pulled up the Hargrove estate files. He had work to do that had nothing to do with Selena. Probate filings, asset inventories, correspondence with Philip's business partners, and he worked through all of it for the rest of the day with the same steady focus he always brought to it. His assistant, Renee, knocked twice with questions. He answered both of them clearly and correctly. He ate half a sandwich at his desk at 1 o'clock. He did not look at the face-down petition again. Jerome called at 7:22 that evening. David was still at the office, his jacket off and his sleeves rolled up. The city outside his window gone dark and glittering. Talk to me, David said. She opened a private account 14 months ago. Jerome's tone was flat and precise, the voice he used when numbers told him something he didn't like. First week of October. I ran the date. That's the same week your father-in-law got his diagnosis. David said nothing. He picked up his pen. She's been feeding it steady. Jerome continued. Foundation board payments, gifts from Philip, some cash pulls. Balance right now sits at $340,000. A brief pause. There are 2 wire transfers that don't match any of the other patterns. Same destination account. 2 months apart. I ran the beneficial owner on the receiving end. David's pen was poised above the legal pad. Name on the account is B. Wynn, Jerome said. Broderick Wynn. David wrote the name down. He stared at it. Broderick Wynn. Tall man. Firm handshake. Sat at table 7 at the 10th anniversary dinner Selena had planned. Introduced as an old friend from her Spelman days. He had made a toast. He had made Selena laugh. David remembered thinking he had an easy kind of confidence. The kind that didn't cost him anything. Keep going, David said. David set his phone down on the desk. Broderick Wynn. He let the name sit there in his mind for a moment. Not with anger, not yet, but with the cold, clarifying recognition of a man who has just watched a blurry picture come into focus. He uncapped his pen again and drew a single line beneath the name on his legal pad. Then he set the pen down, pushed back from his desk, and walked to the far wall of his office. The filing cabinet there was dark gray steel, 4 drawers tall, with a combination lock bolted to the face of it. Not the kind of cabinet you bought at an office supply store. The kind you had built. David had commissioned it 7 years ago, when the Hargrove estate had grown complex enough that he didn't want its documents anywhere near a standard lock. He worked the combination from memory, 12 right, 4 left, 31 right, and pulled open the 3rd drawer. The Hargrove file was thick. 2 accordion folders bound together with a wide rubber band, plus a slim manila envelope clipped to the outside that held the most recent additions. David carried all of it back to his desk, sat down, and spread it open under the lamp. He moved through the documents in order. The original will, drafted 9 years ago. The First Amendment, filed 6 years later when Philip sold his Southeast portfolio and restructured his liquid holdings. The Second Amendment, 2 years after that. And then, near the back of the second accordion folder, tucked behind the asset inventory sheets, the final codicil, 16 months old, dated 3 weeks after Philip's diagnosis. David had sat across from Philip at a small round table in a private hospital conference room when they drafted it. Philip had been tired that day, but precise. He knew what he wanted, and he said it plainly, which was how he had always operated. David had listened, asked clarifying questions, and then gone home and written the language himself, careful and exact. The way you write something you know will matter later. He read it now the same way he read everything. Straight through, once, slowly, without skimming. The clause was on page 3. It was 11 sentences long. David had written every one of them. The language was clear. If Selena Hargrove Okafor initiated divorce proceedings, or if a legal separation was filed by either party, prior to the final distribution of the estate, the inheritance structure changed. The estate would not transfer as a lump sum. Instead, it would enter a managed trust. The trust would pay out $2 million annually for 20 years, totaling $40 million over the life of the arrangement. All remaining assets, the properties, the portfolios, the liquid accounts, would stay inside the trust, managed and invested at the trustee's discretion, until the 20-year term expired. The trustee named in the document was David Okafor. David read that line twice, not because he had forgotten it. He had not forgotten a single word of this document, but because seeing it in print on this particular night, with the divorce petition face down 12 inches away, made the full weight of it land differently than it ever had before. Philip had known something. Not everything, maybe, but something. David remembered the afternoon they had finished drafting the codicil. Philip had signed it, capped his pen, and leaned back in his chair with the careful slowness of a man conserving energy. He had looked at David for a long moment before he spoke. "I love my daughter," he had said. "I want that in the record, in case you ever wonder. But love and trust are not the same thing, and money has a way of showing you the difference." David had not asked him to explain. He had notarized the document, filed a copy with the court, and kept the original in this cabinet. He looked at the codicil now and understood, with a clarity that felt almost quiet, what Selena had done to herself. She had filed for divorce believing she was walking toward $500 million. Liquid. Immediate. Hers to spend. Hers to share. Hers to move to whatever account in whatever country she and Broderick Wynne had decided on. She had retained the best divorce attorney in Atlanta. She had frozen their joint accounts. She had been precise and fast and entirely confident. And in doing all of that, in filing those papers the day after her father was in the ground, she had triggered the one clause in the one document that changed everything. She had done it herself. David closed the codicil carefully and set it back in its place in the folder. He replaced the rubber band around both accordion folders. He returned everything to the third drawer, swung it shut, and worked the combination lock back to 0. He sat down at his desk. He picked up his phone and called Jerome. "Still up?" he said when Jerome answered. "For you? Always. What do you need?" "Keep going," David said. Broderick Wynne, his fund, his debt structure, his investor filings, anything tied to Selena moving forward. Build the whole picture. Don't stop until it's complete. How much time do I have? As much as you need, David said. Nobody knows what I know yet. And I'm not in a hurry. He hung up. He pulled the legal pad in front of him. He uncapped his pen. And he began to write. Jerome showed up at 7:15 in the morning. David heard the knock, opened the front door, and found his brother standing on the porch with a laptop bag over one shoulder and a thick stack of printed pages tucked under his arm. Jerome was still wearing the same clothes from the night before. His eyes were alert anyway. "Coffee first," David said, stepping back to let him in. "After," Jerome said. He moved straight to the kitchen table, set everything down, and started spreading papers across the surface in a pattern that only made sense to him. Columns of transaction records, corporate filing sheets, a hand-drawn timeline on yellow paper that ran the full length of one side of the table. By the time David came back with 2 mugs anyway, Jerome was already seated. laptop open, one finger tracking a line of numbers on a printed page. "Talk," David said. Jerome looked up. Broderick Wynn's fund, Wynn Capital Advisors, has been underwater for at least 3 years. He's been managing it with investor money, moving funds between accounts to cover redemption requests while the underlying positions keep losing. He tapped the stack of corporate filings. SEC disclosures show a 31% drawdown in the main fund, but the real number is worse. I cross-referenced against the positions he reported to his prime broker last year. He turned the laptop so David could see the screen. He's down closer to 60. David looked at the number. He did not react. He just looked at it. "How long before it collapses?" he asked. 8 months, maybe less. Jerome pulled the yellow timeline toward him. "But here's what matters." He pointed to a date near the left end of the line. "Philip gets diagnosed. 14 months ago." He moved his finger to the right. 6 weeks later, Wynn Capital starts showing the first signs of liquidity stress. Redemption requests go up. New investor money goes down. Another move. 2 months after that, here, he tapped a printed transaction record. Selena opens the private account. First deposit, $40,000, cash. David picked up the transaction record and read it. Jerome continued. The wire transfers to Broderick come later. 2 of them. One for $90,000, one for $210,000. Total of $300,000 moved from Selena's private account to a holding company called Vantage Bridge LLC. He slid a corporate filing across the table. Vantage Bridge is registered in Delaware. Sole member, Broderick James Wynn. David set the transaction record down and picked up the corporate filing. He read it the same way he read the codicil the night before. Straight through. No skimming. She was funding him, David said. She was keeping him solvent long enough to reach the inheritance, Jerome said. That's not an affair, David. That's a business arrangement with a romantic cover. He leaned back in his chair. The divorce filing, the timing of it, the speed, the attorney she retained, none of it was about getting out of the marriage. It was about getting the money into her hands before his margin call arrives. She needed a lump sum. He needed a lump sum. They needed it in the same window. David was quiet for a moment. He looked at the timeline, the full length of it, from Philip's diagnosis to the morning the process server walked into his office. Every point on that line connected to the next one. The account opening, the wire transfers, Broderick's deteriorating fund, Selena's divorce filing. It was not a coincidence. It was not grief. It was a schedule. He went through the rest of Jerome's file the same way he'd gone through everything else, methodically, without rushing, reading each document fully before moving to the next one. Corporate filings, bank records, a printout of Wynn Capital's last 2 investor letters, their language growing more careful and evasive with each quarter. A timeline grid Jerome had built that laid every event in chronological order. When he finished, he squared the pages back into a neat stack, aligned the edges, and set them down on the table. "This is good work," David said. "It's complete work," Jerome said. "Everything in there will hold up." David nodded. He picked up the file, carried it to the drawer in the hallway cabinet where he had started keeping everything connected to this situation, and placed it inside. He closed the drawer. He came back to the kitchen. Jerome was finally drinking the coffee, both hands wrapped around the mug, watching his brother. "Is that enough?" Jerome asked. "Almost," David said. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from him. "There's one more piece. Something I think exists, but I don't have it yet. I need a source." He paused. Philip's sister. Jerome was quiet for a second. "Aunt Pat. She was with him through most of the illness," David said. "She saw things." He reached for his own mug. "I think Philip may have told her something, or left something with her. I don't know exactly what, but I know him well enough to know he wouldn't have gone without putting something somewhere safe." David picked up his phone from the counter and pulled up Patricia's number. She answered on the second ring. "David," she said. Her voice was warm but unsurprised, the way it always was, like she had been expecting the call. "Aunt Pat," he said, "I'd like to come see you tomorrow, if that's all right." Patricia Hargrove lived in a brick Tudor on a quiet street in Buckhead, behind a row of old oak trees that kept the yard in shade most of the day. David pulled up at 2 in the afternoon with a container of jerk chicken from the place on Cascade Road that Patricia had mentioned once, 4 years ago at a family dinner, that she liked. He had remembered that. She opened the door before he reached the porch steps. "You brought food," she said. "I did." "Good." She stepped back and let him in. "I haven't eaten since this morning." The house smelled like cedar and old books, and something faintly floral, the same way it always had, every time David had visited over the years. Patricia led him to the kitchen, took the container from him without ceremony, and began plating the food while David sat down at the round table near the window. The afternoon light came in through the curtains in long yellow strips. They ate first. That was Patricia's way. She did not discuss difficult things on an empty stomach, and she did not perform grief for company. She asked David about Jerome, about work, about whether he'd been sleeping. He answered honestly. She listened the way she always did, fully, without interruption, her dark eyes steady. When the plates were cleared, she folded her hands on the table and looked at him. "There are 2 things I need to tell you," she said, "and I've been waiting on the right time for one of them for a while." David nodded. "About 8 months ago," she said, "I was meeting a friend for dinner at a restaurant in Midtown. Alma. You know it?" "I know it. I was early, waiting at the bar." She paused. "I saw Selena come in. She didn't see me. She was already looking toward the back of the room, like she knew exactly where she was going." Patricia's voice stayed even. She was not performing anything. She was just reporting what she saw, the way she always reported things, plainly, without decoration. Broderick Wynne was at a corner table. He stood up when she came in. He kissed her. Not a hello kiss. The other kind. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. "They were there for almost 2 hours," Patricia continued. "I watched from the bar long enough to be sure of what I was seeing. Then I left." She looked at David. "I didn't say anything. Not to Philip, not to you. Philip was already sick, and I had no proof of anything beyond what my eyes told me. I thought about it for weeks. I decided I'd rather carry it than cause him pain he couldn't do anything about." She paused. "I don't know if that was the right decision." "It was," David said quietly. She studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "The second thing." She pushed her chair back and left the kitchen. David heard her in the back of the house, a closet, the sound of a box being moved. She came back a minute later with a plain white envelope in her hand. His name was written on the front in Philip's handwriting, the careful, slightly formal print of a man who had spent decades signing contracts. Patricia set it on the table in front of him. "He gave me this about 3 weeks before he died," she said. "He told me to hold it until after divorce papers were filed. He said, 'He'll know when it's time.'" She sat back down. "I've had it in that box since October." David looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he picked it up and opened it carefully, the way you open something that cannot be replaced. 2 pages, handwritten on Philip's personal stationery, the cream-colored kind with his initials at the top. At the bottom of the second page, a notary stamp and signature. David read it from the beginning, slowly. Philip's voice came off the page the way it always had in conversation. Direct, unhurried, with the particular weight of a man who chose his words because he meant them. He wrote that 3 months before he died, he had been riding back from a doctor's appointment and looked out the window on Peachtree Street and seen his daughter walking into a building he recognized, a building where Adrienne Voss kept her offices. He wrote that he sat with it for 2 days before he was certain of what it meant. He did not confront Selena. He called David's office the following week and asked to revisit the codicil language instead. Near the bottom of the first page, one line sat by itself. The law will handle what love couldn't. On the second page, he addressed David directly. He wrote that he was sorry, that watching a good man get treated as disposable was its own kind of grief, that he had updated the documents precisely because he knew David would know what to do with them, and because he trusted David's judgment more than he trusted his daughter's intentions. He ended it plainly, without sentimentality, the way Philip ended most things. "I want you to be okay after all this, David. That's the only thing I actually want." David read it twice. Then he folded it along its original creases, slid it back into the envelope, and placed it in the inside pocket of his jacket. He looked up at Patricia. Her eyes were steady, but they were not dry. "Thank you," he said. That was all. It was enough. She walked him to the door. He stepped out into the late afternoon shade, walked to his car, and drove home. He pulled into his driveway at 4:53 and turned off the engine. He did not get out. He sat there with both hands in his lap and looked at the front of his house, the empty porch, the dark windows, the ordinary stillness of a life that had been quietly taken apart while he was busy being faithful to it. He did not cry. He had done something that felt like grief in the weeks after the divorce filing, alone, in the kind of small moments that don't announce themselves, standing in the kitchen, or waking up too early, or driving past a restaurant he and Selena had liked. That was not what he felt now. What he felt now was clean, settled. The particular stillness that comes when the last piece of something slides into place, and the shape of the whole thing finally becomes visible. After a while, he got out of the car. He went inside. He set his keys on the counter, poured a glass of water, and drank half of it standing at the sink. Then he picked up his phone, found the number for Adrienne Voss's office, and dialed. The receptionist answered on the third ring. "I'd like to schedule the mandatory estate disclosure meeting," David said. "For all parties. Tell Ms. Voss that David Okafor is calling. She'll know the case." Broderick's penthouse was on the 31st floor of a building in Midtown that had a doorman, a private elevator, and a view of the city that looked like something you'd frame and sell. The kind of place designed to make you feel like you were above everything, because technically you were. Selena stood at the floor-to-ceiling window with a glass of wine, looking out at the Atlanta skyline going amber in the early evening. The lights were just beginning to come on across the city. Below her, traffic moved in slow ribbons, small and far away and irrelevant. Broderick was behind her at the kitchen island, plating food from containers the restaurant had sent up. He always ordered from places that sent it up. He had not cooked a meal in the 2 years she had known him, and she had stopped noticing. 90 days is too long, he said. She did not turn around. Adrienne says 90 days is aggressive. Most high-asset dissolutions take 6 to 9 months. Adrienne isn't the one with the timeline. I know your timeline, Brod. Then act like it. He set a plate on the counter with a sound that was almost, not quite, a slam. I need the capital liquid before the end of the quarter. If we're still sitting in probate when August hits, we won't be. She turned from the window and carried her wine to the island. She sat down on one of the tall stools and looked at him with the particular patience she had developed over the last 2 years. The kind that was not really patience, but looked like it from the outside. David is not going to fight this. He doesn't have the appetite for a drawn-out legal war. He'll take what Adrienne offers and move on. That's who he is. Broderick picked up his fork. He pointed it at her, not aggressively, more like a man making a point in a meeting. That's who you think he is. That's who he's always been. She took a sip of her wine. 11 years, Broderick. I know how David handles things. He goes quiet. He works. He doesn't make scenes. She set her glass down. He's probably buried in files right now, processing everything through that orderly little brain of his, And when Adrian puts a settlement offer in front of him, he'll take it because he'll decide it's the logical thing to do. Broderick chewed and said nothing. That meant he was still worried, but had run out of the specific argument. She recognized the look. She had been managing his worry for months now, the same way she managed everything, with a calm surface that kept other people from seeing the machinery underneath. The worry used to bother her. It didn't anymore. He needed her to be the steady one, and she was fine being the steady one, because she was the one with the inheritance. That had always been the actual structure of things, underneath the dinners and the wine and the view. $2 million a year for 20 years. Broderick said it quietly, and with a smile that was soft and sure. By August, she looked at the city and felt what she always felt when she let herself think about it fully. A loosening, like something that had been cinched too tight, finally releasing. $500 million. The Hargrove name had always meant wealth in the abstract, a background condition, like weather. Growing up, she had been aware of money the way you're aware of air. It was there, it was assumed, but she had always been in proximity to it rather than in possession of it, orbiting her father's decisions, subject to his judgment, her life shaped by what he approved or withheld. Even her marriage, even David, with his competence and his steadiness and his earnest commitment to doing everything correctly, had been, in some quiet way, another condition of her father's world, rather than her own. This was different. This was the whole thing, finally, in her hands. She had told Sasha and Dominique over lunch last week that she and David had simply grown in different directions, that he was a wonderful man. She always said that part, always included it, because it made the rest of the narrative land cleaner, but that she had spent years trying to fit herself into a shape that wasn't really hers, that she was choosing herself now. Both women had nodded with the particular warmth of people who believe they are witnessing courage. She was fine with that. Let them believe it. David did not know about the codicil's implications. How could he? Probate wasn't formally complete. The estate structure hadn't been disclosed to her yet, because there was nothing to disclose yet. Everything was still in motion, all of it moving exactly where she had aimed it. She lifted her wine glass again. Her phone buzzed on the counter. She picked it up without urgency, expecting Adrian or Sasha or the building's front desk about a delivery. It was a certified mail notification. She opened it. Estate of Philip Raymond Hargrove. Mandatory disclosure meeting. All beneficiaries and associated counsel are required to appear. Thursday, 10:01 a.m. Hargrove Estate and Trust. Notice issued by David A. Okafor, trustee. Jerome called at 7:14 in the morning. David was already up. He was at the kitchen counter with coffee, reviewing notes, the kind of quiet that belonged to a man who had not slept deeply in several weeks, but had stopped expecting to. He answered on the second ring. "Tell me," he said. Jerome did not ease into it. He never did. She tried to buy one of the properties. David set his coffee down. Buckhead Commerce Center, Jerome said. The commercial building on Peachtree. It's in the portfolio at $47 million. She ran it through a shell company. LLC registered in Delaware, filed 6 weeks before your father-in-law died. The buyer of record is a man named Curtis Prewitt. He's a property manager out of Decatur. Small operation, no real capital. Jerome paused. He didn't have $47 million, David. He was a name on a document. A straw purchaser. That's right. The offer came in at a lowball, $31 million, structured to look like an arm's-length distressed sale. If probate had closed the way she expected it to, the transaction would have processed quietly, and she would have recaptured the property through the shell company after the fact. Jerome's voice was flat, professional. He was a man delivering facts, not editorializing. But David could hear something underneath the flatness, a particular kind of controlled anger that Jerome had been carrying since the beginning of this. There's more. Go ahead. The offer was submitted with a power of attorney authorizing Prewitt to act on behalf of the estate during the pre-probate window. The signature on it is Philip's. Another pause. It's not Philip's. The kitchen was very quiet. It was pulled from an older document, Jerome continued. One of the property management agreements from 2019. Someone lifted the signature and reproduced it. It's close. Close enough that a distracted title clerk might not have caught it. But I had a document examiner look at it last night. She put it in writing this morning. David did not say anything for a moment. He looked at the wall above the counter. Just a plain white wall, nothing on it. And he looked at it like it was something he was reading carefully. "Send me everything," he said. "The shell company filings, the offer documents, the examiner's report, all of it, already on its way." "Jerome," David picked his coffee back up. "Good work." "Don't thank me yet," Jerome said. "Thank me Thursday." David spent the rest of that morning at his desk. He had Philip's notarized letter. He had Jerome's full financial timeline, Selena's hidden account, the wire transfers to Broderick, the forensic map of Broderick's collapsing fund. He had Patricia's testimony about the Midtown restaurant. He had the codicil. And now he had the shell company, the straw purchaser, and a forged signature on a fraudulent power of attorney. Each piece had weight on its own. Together, they were something else entirely. He built 2 bound packages, identical in content, clean-tabbed dividers, documents in chronological order, every exhibit labeled. He worked the way he always worked, without hurry, without wasted motion. 1 package for the meeting record, 1 for his files. He also drafted a separate legal notice. Broderick Wynne had a documented business interest in Selena's expected inheritance. Jerome's records showed the entanglement clearly, the wire transfers, the contingent financial arrangement between them. Under Georgia probate law, a party with a contingent financial interest in an estate's distribution had the right, and in some circumstances the obligation, to be represented at a formal disclosure proceeding. David filed the notice correctly, precisely, and without any pleasure on his face. He sent it to Broderick's attorney of record through certified channels. It was not a trap. It was the law. The law simply happened to require that Broderick Wynne sit in that room on Thursday morning. He arrived at Hargrove Estate and Trust at 8:47 a.m. The building was on West Peachtree, a mid-rise of dark glass and pale stone that Philip had chosen for its quiet formality. The lobby had marble floors and low lighting, the kind of place that was designed to communicate that serious things happened here. David had walked through its doors hundreds of times. Today felt the same as all those times. That was not an accident. He had worked at feeling nothing unusual, not triumph, not dread, just the steady readiness of a man who had prepared completely and had nothing left to do but execute. The conference room was on the 4th floor. Long table, high-backed chairs, tall windows on the far wall letting in the flat gray light of an early Thursday morning. A credenza along one wall. A clock above the door. He set 1 bound package at the head of the table where he would sit. He set the second to his right. He straightened them once, adjusted the alignment, and left them there. Patricia came in quietly at 9:15. She was wearing a dark blazer, her silver hair neat, her expression composed in the way of a person who has been ready for a long time. She chose a chair along the side of the table, settled her bag in her lap, and looked at David with a small nod that said everything it needed to say. Jerome arrived at 9:22 with his laptop under his arm. He sat near the back of the room, opened the computer, and did not speak. David took his seat at the head of the table and folded his hands in front of him. The clock above the door read 9:31. Adrienne Voss walked in at 10:04. She was a tall woman, precise in the way of someone who had spent decades making sure every detail of her appearance communicated control. Dark suit, hair pulled back, a leather portfolio under one arm. She scanned the room the moment she entered it. The table, the bound packages, Jerome in the back with his laptop, and her expression did not change, but her pace slowed just slightly, a fraction of a second, enough for David to notice. Selena came in behind her. She was dressed sharply, a fitted cream blazer, earrings that caught the light, her posture easy and upright. She looked like a woman arriving at a formality she expected to conclude before lunch. Her eyes moved to David and settled there for a moment, cool, composed, carrying none of the weight the room already held. She took the chair Adrian Voss indicated, crossed her legs, and set her hands in her lap. She did not say good morning. Neither did David. Broderick's attorney arrived alone at 10:07. His name was Gerald Park, a compact man in his mid-50s, with careful eyes and a cautious energy. He had clearly been briefed on very little. He found a seat along the side of the table, opened his portfolio, and waited. David looked at the clock. 10:08. He began. He opened procedurally, the way he always opened these meetings, with structure, with sequence, without theater. He distributed the bound estate summaries, one copy per party. He walked the room through the asset index, the commercial properties, the liquid accounts, the portfolio holdings. He named values. He cited document references. He moved at a steady, unhurried pace, the same pace he used in every estate proceeding he had ever run. And the room followed him into the rhythm of it. Adrian Voss made notes. Gerald Park followed along in his copy. Selena turned pages with the mild attention of someone waiting for the part that concerned her. Then David reached the codicil. He opened his own copy to the tabbed section. He did not announce it dramatically. He simply said, "The estate's final codicil, executed 16 months ago, contains a distribution condition I'll read into the record now." He read it aloud. Flat, unhurried, precise. Every word the way Philip had intended it. Clean, unambiguous, without room for interpretation. Adrian Voss stopped writing. David kept reading. When he reached the spousal disqualification clause, he read it twice, the first time for the record. The second time because he wanted every person in that room to understand it completely before he moved on. The clause was not complicated. It did not need to be. If Selena initiated or participated in divorce proceedings prior to estate distribution, the inheritance did not transfer as a lump sum. It entered a managed trust, structured distributions of $2 million annually. For 20 years, he lowered the document. The trustee named in the codicil, David said, is David Okafor. The room was quiet. Selena's composure did not shatter. It fractured, slowly, incrementally, the way ice fractures before it breaks. First the small stillness that replaced her ease, then her eyes moving to her attorney with something she was working to keep off her face. Then the working of a calculation she could not make come out differently, no matter how she ran it. Adrian Voss leaned forward. "We'll need a continuance to review the codicil language and—" The probate filing incorporating this codicil was completed and confirmed 11 days ago, David said. There is nothing in this document subject to renegotiation in this room. Voss looked down at the bound copy in front of her. She was reading quickly, her eyes moving down the page. She was good. She saw it immediately. The structure, the language, the way it had been drafted. She understood what she was looking at. Selena's voice, when it came, was quiet and tight. "You knew about this?" David looked at her directly. "You always knew," she said. It was not quite a question. "I drafted it," David said. He let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. Then he reached for the second bound package. "There's an additional matter of record." Jerome opened his laptop in the back of the room without being asked. The sound of keys. David walked them through it methodically. The Shell Company, Delaware LLC, filed 6 weeks before Philip's death. Curtis Prewitt, property manager out of Decatur, listed as buyer of record for the Buckhead Commerce Center at a below-market offer of $31 million. The paper trail connecting the shell company back to Selena through a series of intermediary accounts Jerome had documented in full. The timeline. Then the power of attorney. He set the document examiner's report on the table. "The signature on this instrument is not Philip Hargrove's," David said. He looked at Gerald Park. "Your client has a documented contingent financial interest in Ms. Hargrove Okafor's expected inheritance. The evidence I have just presented is the foundation for a civil fraud action and a referral to the Georgia Attorney General's office. The forged instrument alone constitutes a Class C felony under Georgia law." He paused. "I'd encourage you to advise your client accordingly." Gerald Park had stopped taking notes. He was very still. David reached into the folder at his right and removed a single document. A copy of Philip's letter. 2 pages, handwritten, notarized. He slid it across the table to Selena without a word. She looked at it. She did not touch it. Patricia's voice came from the side of the table, quiet and even. "Your father loved you, Selena." She did not look away from her. "He just stopped trusting you. There's a difference." The room held that silence. Selena's hands stayed still in her lap. The letter sat in front of her untouched, Philip's handwriting facing up. David got home at 12:43 in the afternoon. The house was quiet. It was always quiet now. He set his keys on the table by the door, loosened his tie, and walked to the study. He opened the fireproof safe in the lower cabinet, placed Philip's original letter inside, the 2 handwritten pages, the notary seal still crisp at the bottom, and closed it. He spun the dial. He stood there for a moment with his hand resting on the face of the safe. Then he sat down at his desk and started drafting the AG referral. He worked for 3 hours without stopping. The document was precise, organized, and completely without editorializing. He did not call Selena names. He did not characterize her motives. He simply laid out what happened, in what order, supported by what evidence, and let the facts do the work that feelings would have done badly. Jerome had already sent over the complete forensic file. David attached everything: the shell company filings, the transaction records, the document examiner's report on the forged signature, Curtis Prewitt's name, address, and his documented role as the straw purchaser. He filed it electronically at 4:17 p.m. Then he ordered food, ate without tasting it, and went to bed. The 6 weeks that followed moved in their own quiet rhythm. Not dramatic, not loud, but relentless in the way that consequence always is when the foundation it rests on is solid. Curtis Prewitt was the first domino. He was a property manager from Decatur who had done one thing wrong for what he thought was easy money. And when a letter from the Georgia Attorney General's office arrived at his home address on a Wednesday morning, he hired a lawyer who told him exactly how exposed he was. He gave a full statement within the week, clear, detailed, and corroborated by the financial records Jerome had already assembled. He named Selena. He described the arrangement. He signed it. Selena was charged with fraudulent use of a power of attorney. Adrienne Voss was skilled enough to keep it from going further than that. She negotiated hard, and the criminal exposure was reduced to a civil settlement with restitution to the estate. No prison, no guilty plea in the traditional sense, but the charge was public record. It did not go away. It sat in the Georgia court system attached to Selena Hargrove Okafor's name like a stone tied to a rope, and it would be there whenever anyone searched her. Broderick's collapse was quieter and faster than David had expected. The margin call arrived on a Tuesday, 14 days after the estate meeting. His fund had been held together by calculations that required Selena's inheritance to be liquid, substantial, and imminent. It was none of those things now, and the math fell apart all at once, the way over-leveraged structures always do. Not gradually, but in a single, catastrophic moment when the last assumption fails. His investors filed suits within the month. 3 separate actions in federal court, each one documenting a different form of misrepresentation. The SEC opened a preliminary inquiry into fund operations that his attorneys described, privately, as unlikely to resolve in his favor. He liquidated the Buckhead penthouse. The car followed. A black Porsche that had been, David suspected, purchased on margin like everything else Broderick owned. He relocated to a rental apartment in Marietta, a 2-bedroom unit in a complex off the highway, the kind of address that would have been unthinkable to him 18 months ago. David knew this because Jerome, who continued following financial filings as a matter of professional habit, mentioned it without being asked. "Marietta," Jerome said over the phone, his voice carrying nothing but the plain fact of it. "All right," David said. Selena's social circle dissolved with a particular efficiency that only money could engineer. The people who had surrounded her were not, for the most part, people who had loved her. They had loved proximity to the Hargrove name, to the dinners and the invitations, and the easy assumption that her wealth was vast and permanent and freely shared. When the trust structure became public knowledge, when it became clear that the Hargrove estate was not a liquid inheritance but a managed disbursement controlled by the ex-husband, the invitations stopped. The group texts went quiet. The friends who had called her brave for finally choosing herself chose something else. She was not destitute. $2 million a year was more than most people would see in a lifetime. But it was not what she had planned for, and it arrived in annual installments she could not accelerate, could not leverage, and could not share with a man who no longer had anything to offer her in return. Patricia called on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks to the day after the meeting. "I've been watching the news," she said, without preamble. "I know," David said. She was quiet for a moment. Philip would have hated seeing it come to this. David said nothing. He knew she wasn't finished. A pause, the sound of her exhaling softly. But he'd planned for it anyway. Her voice settled into something certain, because he was a realist. She laughed. A short, quiet sound, genuinely warm. "You get that from him a little," she said. 12 months later. The sign was simple. Clean black letters on frosted glass, mounted beside a door on the 14th floor of a midtown building that smelled like new carpet and fresh paint. Okafor and Branch Estate Law. David sat in his car for a moment and looked at it through the windshield. He had looked at it the same way every morning for the past 3 months, and it still landed the same way each time. Not with pride exactly, but with something quieter and more durable than pride. Something that felt like evidence. He got out, straightened his jacket, and went inside. 14 months had passed since the Thursday meeting. The first thing David had done, once the probate court confirmed the trust structure and the dust from the AG referral had settled, was file a petition to remove himself as trustee. He had written the motion himself in 2 hours on a Saturday morning. The language was simple and clean. The named trustee, having been party to the dissolution proceedings and the subsequent legal actions arising from the estate, respectfully petitioned the court to appoint an independent corporate trustee in the interest of impartiality and ongoing estate integrity. He cited 3 precedents. He attached a recommended replacement, a reputable Atlanta trust company with a long institutional track record. The court approved it in 11 days. He had never wanted Selena's money. That was the part some people struggled to understand when the story filtered out through professional circles, as it eventually did in pieces and whispers. They assumed that holding the trustee position would have felt like winning, like a kind of ownership over the woman who had betrayed him. But that was not what David had wanted. He had wanted Philip's intentions honored. He had wanted the architecture to hold. Those were not the same thing as wanting control over Selena's life. And he understood the difference clearly enough that stepping away from the role felt not like sacrifice, but like completion. The work was done. Someone else could administer the paperwork. The firm had been his colleague Nadine Branch's idea, technically. She had proposed it over lunch 8 months ago, sliding a napkin across the table with a rough sketch of a name and a business model. David had read it, folded it, put it in his jacket pocket, and called her the next morning to say yes. Nadine was sharp, direct, and had spent 12 years watching large firms handle complex estate work, with the kind of institutional carelessness that came from having too many clients and not enough attention. She wanted to build something smaller and more precise. So did David. The Hargrove case, handled with complete discretion, never publicized by name, had nonetheless done something to David's professional reputation that no marketing could have manufactured. The attorneys who knew. The financial advisors who had watched the estate proceedings understood what it meant that the trust architecture had held against every challenge thrown at it. Referrals came from directions David hadn't expected. His client list had tripled. He worked hard, and he worked carefully, which had always been true, but now the work felt fully his in a way it hadn't before. He wasn't managing an estate that belonged to someone else's family. He was building something with his name on the door. The house in Cascade Heights had a front porch. That was the detail that had sold him on it, which he recognized was not the most lawyerly basis for a real estate decision. But he had stood on that porch on a bright October morning with his hands in his pockets and looked out at the street. The old trees, the quiet, the particular quality of the light coming through the branches, and he had known immediately. Jerome came for Sunday dinners most weeks. He showed up with grocery bags and opinions about whatever David had planned to cook, and they ate at the kitchen table and talked about work and sports and nothing important. And it was the most grounding 2 hours of David's week without fail. Patricia called every Tuesday morning at 8:15. She had been calling at 8:15 for 14 months, and she had never once mentioned that it was a pattern. Neither had David. They talked about small things, mostly. Her garden, his cases, whatever was on her mind. Sometimes she mentioned Philip. A memory, something he used to say, a way he used to laugh. David always listened carefully. The way you listen when you know the thing being shared is irreplaceable. He was not dating anyone. He was not in a hurry. The question of what came next in that part of his life sat somewhere in the background, patient and undemanding, and he left it there without guilt. He did not miss Selena. That was the truth, and he had made his peace with it. What he missed was the person he had believed she was, the woman he had built 11 years around, and he had learned, slowly and with some difficulty, that these were two entirely different griefs. One was about loss. The other was about an illusion. Mourning an illusion was its own particular kind of work, and he was doing it, and he was fine. On a quiet Saturday morning in early spring, David drove to Westview Cemetery alone. No flowers. He had never brought flowers. He didn't think Philip would have wanted them. He parked on the narrow cemetery road and walked across the grass to the headstone. Gray granite, modest for a man of Philip's means, which was exactly what Philip had specified. David stood in front of it in the early light, hands loose at his sides, the air still cool and carrying the faint smell of cut grass from somewhere nearby. He stood there for a while. He thought about the last real conversation they'd had, not the final hours, when Philip was too tired for words, but 3 weeks before that, when the old man had looked at him from the hospital bed with clear eyes, and said, in the plain and unhurried voice he used when he meant something completely, "I want you to be okay after all this, David. That's the only thing I actually want." David had told him he would be. He had meant it when he said it. He just hadn't known yet whether it was true. He knew now. He stood at the grave a little longer. Then he turned and walked back across the grass to his car, got in, and drove home through the quiet spring morning. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.